y'all don't worry about anything. I think we've accomplished that goal. I just want to make sure that I can, yep, got the PowerPoint right. I'm Alan Yacoubian. I've been a member of LASIE for many years. I see out in the audience a lot of good friends and people that I've worked with over the years. So let me start off by thanking you for being here. I realize I think this is the last session for this program on a Wednesday morning when a lot of you are going to try to finish your work week. So those that are here, we really appreciate you being here. And I want to thank Gary Patero because I've known Gary for years. And I think anyone that knows Gary knows that when it comes to LASIE in this seminar, it means everything to him. So our preparation for this final presentation is kind of with that in mind. I'm the moderator, and Gary has reminded me of that fairly consistently because Gary wanted me to appreciate the fact that the moderator means you don't talk about it. So you all will be obviously encouraged by those instructions. But in the event that somehow I don't appreciate the role of a moderator, I think of the old saying, those who can't do, teach, and those who can't teach, teach PE. And I can't teach PE, so I don't know what I'm going to be able to do with today's topic. But let me just talk about it real quick, briefly, just so y'all can kind of get an idea of what we're trying to accomplish, and then we can kind of dive down. Our topic is return to work. And for us, we kind of spent some time going through everything. It's critical that you have a successful return to work program. And I can't think of really any better way of accomplishing that than to have two experts in the field. Two experts that focus on getting that injured worker, and we're going to use that term a lot, injured worker. We're not here to debate whether an employee is hurt. We're past that now. When you talk about return to work, you're talking about getting that employee back into the workforce. So to my left, your right, I've got Dr. Doug Lurie, who I've known for many years out of New Orleans. He reminded me that I said orthopedic, I said New Orleans Orthopedic Associates. He corrected me. Orthopedic Associates of New Orleans, but I can say from firsthand experience that we as a law firm and my family have used their facility for many years, and I think Doug adds a lot of value when it comes to the view of an orthopedic surgeon who does perform surgery, but his ultimate goal is to get that injured patient back to work or back to full movement. Would that be a fair statement?
I'd say one of the ways to basically judge the success of treatment, for example, in sports medicine, would be, does the athlete return to their sport? Do they tear their ACL and get back to playing football? And I think when you take care of work injuries, the way that you should judge yourself as success is if someone can return to work. And obviously the severity of the injury comes into play there, but I think if you go through an entire 2 years of treatment and at the end the activity is no activity, 100% permanent disability, then I view myself as a failure in that case.
We're not going to have any failing up here. So with that said, to my right, we have Dr. Trang Nguyen, who's from, actually practices in Houston, but is an occupational medicine specialist. And I would like Dr. Nguyen to talk a little bit about her perspective when it comes to returning to work.
So once again, good morning, guys. Thank you for staying late for our presentation. I've been practicing occupational medicine for 20 years, okay? The goal for any medical intervention is to help the patient improve the quality of life. Okay, so when it comes to return to work, the patient, we should help the patient return to work, okay, even when they're injured in some sort of capacity. For the last 2 days, we've heard very helpful comments, suggestions by other speakers. The bottom line is, and we'll go into it this morning, help the injured worker return to work in some sort of capacity.
think that's very well said. So when we look at this presentation, what we're going to try to cover is, number one, what does a successful return to work program look like? You know, you got to start with, in my mind, the optimum. And then you look at what are the ingredients for that. And then ultimately you look at what are the shortcomings. So we're going to start off with what does a successful return to work program look like? And then we're going to talk about what are the benefits of a successful work program. And I realize that you all are probably saying, well, we kind of know that. We know what the benefits are. We cut our losses. I get that. But beyond that, we're going to also examine what are the challenges. So we're going to do a deep dive. I just kind of want to give you a quick overlay. And when you look at the success, then we're going to go and examine what is the employer's role. So I don't know how many out there in the audience are self-insured employers. I can tell you that I represent a number of them. And it's tough. And it's tough because the person that you may be handling a case with is not necessarily the person that makes that decision to allow that injured worker to return to work. So I get all the nuances. Finally, we're going to look at what does the injured worker have to do? What does the treating physician have to do? And then the final area of inquiry is what happens if you don't have a successful return to work program. So let's go ahead and start with what does a successful return to work program look like? I will start with Doug, and we're not going to read a PowerPoint to y'all. We've got the PowerPoint up there because it's basically a summary of our thoughts and some of the information that we looked at. So, Doug, I don't know if you want to start and kind of tell us what you envision it would look like.
So if I were viewing this from a physician's perspective to an employer, I would say that an effective return to work program begins with communication, flexibility. Obviously, when you have an injury, you have a loss. And you have to, I guess, unfortunately, sometimes embrace the loss by the loss, not lost, as I've heard people say, take the employee into your bosom and care for them. At the end, the lawyers can fight about the other stuff, but if you have an open line of communication, you show support, early access to medical care, and then flexible return to work programs that are not just draconian, all or nothing type programs. For example, recently I had a patient who worked for the same company for 34 years. He was sitting at a stoplight on a Saturday morning and rear-ended by somebody who was racing, going 70 miles per hour, and he was at a stop. So obviously he had real injuries, he had to have surgery. He got fired after 30 days because he hadn't returned to work. So how easy do you think it's ever going to be to get him to return to work? He has no job to go back to. So,
and the employer got sued after about 10 minutes.
I'm sure they will, as well as
not a successful return to work program.
That is not. I mean, ultimately, he became teary-eyed the first time he told me, and ever since then, his condition has deteriorated. Like, that was the flip of the switch.
Dr. Nguyen?
So I'll summarize it for you guys. The article that you see quoted there, I did a quick literature search for you guys before I came and combed the literature. That's the latest systematic reviews on return to work, successful return to work program, what works, what doesn't work in the literature, okay? And I will summarize it for you. Number one, in addition to the regular treatments that you have to have some sort of health intervention, like cognitive therapy, psychotherapy, PT, OT, work conditioning, work hardening, and it has to be a combinations, okay? Number two is communications, okay? You communicate with the injured worker, you communicate with the treating doctors, you communicate with the employers, everybody stays on the same page. And lastly is work accommodations. Try to accommodate sedentary, light duty, part of the day, a couple of days a week, modified duties. those interventions are recommended.
So if you look at that PowerPoint, you can see what Dr. Nguyen just referenced, that study, and I think as you look at the end, you see work accommodations, which are critical for a successful return to work program, meaning that you can't just say, okay, go back to work. You have to recognize that the injured worker has some permanent impairment, some permanent restrictions that preclude them from returning to their regular position. If they can go back to their regular job, meaning that they have a full release, this isn't a topic that covers that. This is a topic that deals with some restrictions. I've got to say, Dr. Lurie, what percentage of your patients, and this is not to put you on the spot, but I think the audience appreciates the fact that you may not have the ability, if you're just doing a second medical opinion, what percentage of your patients in the workers' compensation field are the patient-driven as opposed to referred to you by the employer?
Most are referred through employers. Nurse case managers refer to a lot of patients. I'd say that's the majority.
That's what I was going to say. So I know we have out in the audience a number of nurse case managers. I don't want you to raise your hand. I'm not trying to put people on the spot or give them an opportunity to promote themselves. I'm going to acknowledge, I'm sure all the folks out here that know their stuff, and I realize this is a very knowledgeable group of people, realizes that the ability to communicate is very complicated in Louisiana, because in Louisiana, the injured worker gets to select his or her physician, and that lawyer, y'all know him out there, that lawyer gets involved very quickly. So a nurse case manager is critical, and I guess I'd like to hear your thoughts about what can a nurse case manager do to enhance the communications between the treating physician of your office and the employer.
So I'll take one step back. So I had a very heavy job utilization review a few years ago, and I kind of like switched. I flipped the switch because I felt like case management has so important a role in the actual outcome of the injured worker. So much so that I actually tried to buy a case management company, abandoned that, and just decided to be a doctor. But ultimately, I think that case management and having an open line of communication between the employer, the insurance company, the injured worker, and the doctor is so critical to the outcome, not only for the medical treatment, but the return to work. Sometimes that can clearly derail when there's an injury attorney, and now the case manager is basically just kind of the person who unfortunately just gets caught in the middle of passing the documents back and forth.
Enhancing the ability to work with nurse case managers.
Okay, guys, one important suggestion. Make sure that treating doctor have the official description, job description from the employer. Okay, make absolutely sure, and employers, you have to have a formal job description for each one of your employees and what they do. Okay, over my 20 years, I can tell you I spoke to numerous treating doctors, and I can tell you maybe 2 have the official job description. If they don't know what your patient has to do, their recommendation may or may not be accurate. So from day one, you make sure that the treating doctors have a copy of that patient's job description.
Are you sure that you weren't once a judge? That's actually law. I like the fact that you suggested that. We try to remind our clients that under Louisiana law, you have to provide a detailed description of the job duties for that modified duty position. So what Dr. Nguyen just said, and I think she was saying from her standpoint, from a medical standpoint, in terms of intelligent return to work programs, I guess the law isn't as stupid as we think it is, because she's saying, without really supporting Louisiana courts, I'm sure that you understand how bad they can be, that it really does make good sense for the employer to provide to the treating physician that description so we can have an intelligent assessment of any impairment.
That's correct. You can't make accommodation, you can't make recommendation if you don't really know what your injured worker has to do at work.
I'm going to start with Dr. Nguyen on this because when we got together and prepared, I have to say that she was extremely passionate in fair terms. She was kind of wondering what I would not want to have her take a deposition. I think you start to throw stuff at me because you think I'm going to cross-examine you. But she was extremely passionate about the benefits of a successful return to work program. So I would encourage y'all to listen to her thoughts on this particular issue because I think that it really speaks, in my mind, to what is really important about it outside of the law. You want to tell us, why do you think that a successful return to work program is so beneficial? What makes it so important?
Well, you know, from the employer perspective, and we are doing studies on this, and we have the data, FYI, from the Ohio Bureau of Workers' Comp. I'm digressing here. But if you look at the data long term, you can tell a lot of things about the workers' comp system in general. And you may say that, well, different states are different, but you know, we're all trying to achieve the same outcomes. Okay, so the importance here is that you're providing treatment. The employee is paying for treatment. Treatment has to be safe and effective. And effectiveness, part of effectiveness in the workers' comp system is returning the patient to work. You want that patient to be productive for the remainder of his or her life, okay? And so from the employer perspective, that's important. From the employee perspective, you want the patient sitting at home. Unemployment and health, which we would discuss later, is not good for the employee. So the system in general is not good for anyone if that patient does not make it back to work.
That's exactly what we talked about when we had our preparation. And I think that if you look at that screen, all you got to look at is one phrase, and that is that employment is the norm. Meaning that to not work is abnormal. To not work is atypical. To not work isn't good. And I don't mean that from the employer's perspective in terms of cutting your losses and dropping your reserves. I mean that from the human level. Dr. Lurie, can you kind of speak to that a little bit for us, just about the psychological element of not working?
Sure. So if you look at return to work outcomes, you can basically, as a background to that, you can predict the outcome of an injury based on the psychological state of the patient by a screening questionnaire better than you can based upon the severity of the injury itself. So with that background, so ultimately, being out of work contributes to physical deconditioning. So sitting at home, the analogy there is if you have an athlete, do we tell them to sit at home on the couch and do nothing and expect them to get better? Or do we ask them to get back on the field with the team even if they can't play? They're still out there contributing and a part and engaged. So that's the physical, but also the psychological, being at home, not working, with underlying concern for the psychological state of the patient already, results in increased depression, anxiety, all types of negative prognosticators, which are more important than the severity of the injury to begin with.
Unless you're Michael Thomas with the Saints making $20 million a year staying at home, but that's another story for another day. But to your point, the longer you stay out, the less likely you're going to return to work. And that's going to create a psychological component that's going to be superimposed on physical interest.
Depression, anxiety, divorce, other medical comorbidities like heart disease. I was at the AAO, American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons annual workers' compensation course this weekend, which we discussed. And the premise of the entire course is it is healthy to return someone to work. It is unhealthy and detrimental to their condition to keep them out of work. So one of the things I would ask you, Alan, is so if I'm doing a deposition, the plaintiff's attorneys always, try to kill me because I want to say someone can go back to light duty. Why don't you ask the injury doctors, like, isn't your treatment a complete failure for the last 2 years if you have been on no activity? Like, can't you flip the switch on that?
Well, it's funny that typically, and I think everyone out here knows that, the lawyer has met with that doctor in advance, in preparation, and anticipates that question. And after a while, it almost becomes comical because it doesn't change from case to case. And so, if out there in the audience, and I'm not knocking Lake Charles, but Lake Charles is pretty notorious in terms of how difficult it is to have successful outcomes relative to return to work, modified duty positions, because the Third Circuit has really kind of cut apart and challenged our efforts in the legislature to have return to work. So to answer the question, I would submit that it's probably best to not come down to a deposition and interrogate the treating physician, but rather, and this is how we do it tactically, hopefully there's not a lot of, there aren't any trial lawyers out there, but they know this, but I don't want to say it openly, but I'll say it to y'all. We believe that nurse case managers are critical to a successful return to work program involving a litigated claim or claim that involves counsel. So I think that's like 90% of all claims, right? I mean, how many claims out there do you have a nice, easygoing, injured worker who you just call up and talk to? I hate to say it, but you don't need Doug, you don't need me, and you probably don't need Dr. Nguyen. So she could probably see him early, which is one of our points too. But because of the 90% of the cases out there, 90% of the injuries out there involve counselors who do everything they can to circumvent and prevent any kind of discourse between the treating physician and the employer. It's critical that the nurse case manager has those competencies and says what you said. Why have you not found some way with all the money you don't say that, all the treatment you provided to be able to have something to show for that treatment? So let's talk quickly about the challenges, because I think these topics all kind of intertwine. You talked about the benefits, you ultimately allude to the challenges. What challenges, Dr. Nguyen, do you see when you're trying to establish a successful return to work program?
So there's a couple of points that I see clinically. Number one, do not delay the patient's medical care. Okay, a lot of the time I see like utilization review, oh, we can't find a treating doctor, denied. Meanwhile, the patient sits there and waiting for the 9 sessions of PT or MRI. Okay, try to find that treating doctor and try to work with him or her. Number 2, communication. Talk to the patient the day that they report the injury. Talk to them throughout the time if you're an employer. And follow up with them even after he or she returned to work, and make sure that it's okay for them and that they can do it, because what you want to do is not only just return to work, but maintain them at work.
Doug, what do you think about that? When you contemplate the challenges to a successful return to work program, what do you see as the #1 challenge?
I think that's a hard question to answer. I think once, it depends.
What's your pet peeve? What gets you to crawl? What do you find is most frustrating? The treating physician not providing any release at all? Personally as a treating physician, when an employer has no light duty options available, I understand if it's a small mom and pop company that sometimes they only have a handful of employees. But when it's a large company and have no light duty positions available, it still contributes to the deconditioning and depression if the person's sitting at home. Even if I have them listed as light duty,
if the job is available. The other side of that is, the other pet peeve is that some doctors, no matter what the injury is, put no activity for the work status without any discretion for how the person is doing. It's very clear that somehow along the way they were counseled that if they get a referral from a certain source, they need to put no activity.
So, quick war story to your point. And I'm going to even mention the doctor because he's now retired. I consider him, at the time, he was a good friend and that we had a lot of respect for him. I'm sure some of the folks out there that have gray hair like me can remember him. Dr. Mark Juno, orthopedic surgeon, based more on the West Bank. You remember him at all? So,
Yes, sir.
you asked about the deposition, and I was defending his deposition. He was an SMO doctor. And he took on the plaintiff's lawyer. I didn't even do anything. I just sat there because there was no need for me to do anything. They call them speaking objections. Whatever you want to say, I was a potted plant. I didn't have to do a thing. But after it was all over with, I asked him. I'll never forget this for as long as I live. I asked him in his conference room, just me and him. I said, Dr. Juno, what would it take for a person to be unable to engage in any form of gainful employment? I'm just talking to him, just you and me. And he said he would have to be paralyzed from the neck down. He said it just like that. And he wasn't joking. And so to your point, when you talk about restrictions or they can do this, you never see any kind of a reference to that kind of criteria. That unless you're paralyzed from the neck down, you can do something.
Well, I'd like to chime in on that, Alan. An argument could be made that if you can't do sedentary or light duty, you probably are not safe to live at home by yourself.
I don't know about that. I like that sometimes. So, and we all see the challenge. The challenge, but I think what you're saying really, what you just said is a life care plan, but not really. But the funny thing is, at the end of the day, you ought to be able to do something. And I think that's what Dr. Juno was alluding to, that unless you're paralyzed from the neck down, you can do something. Now, I think the biggest challenge, and I'll just say what we talk about. The biggest challenge to me is the employer. And I don't want anybody to throw anything at me. I'm going to just say, the employer not offering a modified job that doesn't really exist. They don't have it normally. And I know they call that sham. I understand sham broke rehab. But in my mind, if the employer, you got to be a pretty big company. I get it. If it's like 10 employees or less, it's hard. But if the employer is unwilling to create some kind of a sedentary position, we have no chance because voc rehab in Louisiana is rough. It just is. Whether it's a geographical area and then they move to some town up in North Louisiana, it's a challenge. I'm not saying that it's impossible, but the easiest way to get a worker back to work is for the employer to cooperate with some kind of a modified duty position. So let's talk about the injured worker. We're going to ask the questions in the end. I think y'all will look like you're staying. Arnold Borshak, you got to ask the questions. So I'm going to keep going. Because Gary doesn't want us to run over. What does the injured worker need to do?
The injured worker should report the injury as soon as they know they have an injury. Okay? And the injured worker should also try to work with the employer in doing some sort of work modification. FYI, the human head itself is 8 to 10 pounds. So if you can't say that you can't lift anything at all, that's not true. Biomechanic of the human body, your head alone is 8 to 10 pounds. Okay, so if you sit up with your head attached, you should be able to move at least that much. Seriously,
You want to take your hand and drop the mic on that? I mean, side. I know y'all looking at the defense lawyers like myself and saying, I know you've never said that in a deposition. Well, we can say it now, I'm sure. What would you retort me to that? Because that's a really valid point, that at the end of the day, just doing this requires some strength and mobility. So let's have like a point counterpoint. Saturday Night Live, Jane Curtin over here. What is your retort to that? What do you anticipate the other side would say to that, to me, very basic wisdom?
It's very difficult to do that because I agree. And I also agree that just activities of daily living are consistent with a sedentary work status. So just daily living activities. My retort, which is the retort that the other side would use, is you don't know you can't feel the injured worker's pain. You don't know how much pain that is causing them when you do that. And you might be causing harm to their shoulder when you ask them to raise their hand, even if they can't do it.
Yeah, I think that it's very hard to argue.
But
sports, frequency, duration. What we always see when they cross-examine that modified duty job description is the frequency of the activity, the duration, and they all claim, and I don't think it's really true, that you couldn't sit like that for more than an hour. But the idea of alternating positions to me is toward back. What do you say to someone that argues that that statement is too idealistic and ignores frequency and duration?
well, the employers can accommodate, that's why we have work accommodations. But to Alan's point about you can't prove how much pain the patient has, I would say, sir, but we do understand the human anatomy and pathophysiology of those conditions, and we treat these patients the same way whether or not they're workers' comp. Okay, so if you have low back pain, you treat the patient. If the patient has Blue Cross Blue Shield, you treat them the same way. The treatment protocol for low back pain doesn't change based upon who's paying the bill.
So I don't know that they're going to really critique us for this presentation, but I want to make sure that the PowerPoint somehow ties into a little bit of what we're talking about. So when you look at just a few things that we have that are extra, I'd say lawyer, or claims rep, because all this stuff, they have nothing to do with cooperation with scheduling. That's going to be the claims rep, that's going to be opposing counsel, that's going to be the lawyer, providing a list to the employer of all means of communication, which is a problem. I mean, I had a case a week ago where the claimant was unrepresented and didn't have a cell phone. I'm not being mean because I think everybody in this country, though, has a cell phone. They have it in every part of the world. So it was impossible to reach her. So in my mind, to your point, communication is everything, but the means of communication is essential. And then finally, confirming the availability of transportation. We do see that, which is a joke, but we see it because they can go to the grocery store any day of the week. They can go anywhere they want to go, except to the doctor who's going to release them to modified duty work, and is very accessible. But we know how that works. So we keep looking at some of the things I think we talk about. You said earlier, physical therapy, and I think that the non-compliant patient is a challenge. I would ask Dr. Nguyen, what are your thoughts about somehow enhancing compliance? Because we know with FCEs, when they know that they weren't very cooperative, and you see that, and you kind of get excited, but I'll tell you right now, you don't win a case because of that little entry in the report that says that they didn't put forth full effort. That's just, Wade Fontana could, but I can't win a case on that. So what are your thoughts about the patient that doesn't really qualify?
Having seen patients over the years and being in this system, okay, the workers' comp system is rough, period. Okay, it's rough. It's called full contact sports, okay? And so it's, how it is. It's not what we say, it's how we say it. Okay, so be nice. Be nice to the patient, especially if you're a treating doctor. Be nice, explain it to them. Half the time, to be honest with you, these workers are blue-collar workers. Okay, to be fair, they didn't have the education that we did. They work, you know, that's what they did all their lives. And so you have to explain the system to them. They don't understand the workers' comp system. They don't know why they're being treated that way. They don't even understand the diagnosis. From a doctor perspective, and even when I'm a patient for minor condition, the doctor walks in there and he talks to you very fast. He throws some diagnosis or prescription at you, and he or she walks out. And you're sitting there thinking, hey, what am I supposed to do with this medicine? Okay? So, it's not what we say, it's how we say it. And that's how you're gonna, hopefully, get them to cooperate.
So I'm gonna submit to everyone a written ballot. I want you to write Dr. Nguyen's name down for our next governor and the one medical director. Because I have a feeling that we would all be better off, because I think I heard that yesterday they were commenting about the system in Louisiana and why it's so bad, and people were referencing the governor, and I was talking to another lawyer, and he said, you know, it's the legislature. And I said, you know, the legislature's important, but when you look at some of the appointments that the governor makes that affect workers' comp, medical director being the one that I think about, I think that everyone out here knows that a change in administration can be a good thing. So that's my one little privilege there. What does the employer do? Now, a lot of these things we're already talking about, we've already kind of alluded to, but when you think about employers and how you try to get that injured worker back to work, Doug, what are your thoughts?
Basically, have a flexible return to work program, and that has to include people other than the management. For example, the person's foreman can't. What the injured worker will say is they're retaliating against me. They're making me do stuff I'm not supposed to do. I think everyone has to be engaged with the process, so that there may need to be like a return to work coordinator if it's a big enough company. If not, the company needs to have return to work policies that are likely to be successful. If they're too harsh, not flexible, I don't think that's very beneficial. At the same time, I know some companies where return to work means sitting in the kitchen looking at your phone, and that's not very successful either, because that creates animosity amongst the other employees. It's not really doing anything to keep the person engaged or physically conditioned at all. So I think actually something that feels somewhat productive is essential. It needs to be, there needs to be buy-in from not only the management, but also the people the person's going to be working with.
Yeah, I think it's funny that if I had to provide 2 words for each one of the headings, what does employer need to do? I think it's cooperate and designate. It's one thing to say, okay, we're going to cooperate, but if you don't have anybody in the company really designated to find a way to get that injured worker back by offering some kind of a modified duty position, and that person gets good at it. We all know practice makes perfect. So you're not going to be good at something if you only do it once. You have to start to kind of know how to audible at the line of scrimmage. You're dealing with one employee that's easier to place back in employment, and you're dealing with another that's more difficult. Your thoughts on return to work and what the employer needs to do?
So one suggestion, guys, is of course accommodations, okay? Stay communicated with, not just the employee, but the treating doctors, okay? If you work with the treating doctors, and I know, in Louisiana, they have the right to choose their treating doctors, and some doctors are not cooperative. But the treating doctors should set expectations for the patient from the beginning, okay? Explain the diagnosis to them, expectation for treatment, expectation for return to work, expectation for the duration of modified duties. When people know their expectation, the patient knows that, they kind of have a number or a time frame. So, you know, I've had patients where nobody explained anything to them, and they sit there for weeks on end doing nothing for a diagnosis of contusion. All of a sudden, they're being told to return to work full duty, and they're all upset, and they say nobody told them anything. But so what I would do if I was an employer is make sure you get your case manager to work with the treating doctor, explain and set the expectation early, okay? Let them know what to expect.
Now, I think we kind of, we're not repeating ourselves, but I think we're highlighting and underscoring how the ultimate message of today's, we're not done yet, by the way, so okay, I'm wrapping it up. Can't leave yet. The ultimate message of today's presentation is all hands on deck. It started off, you know, Gary, I thought, did a great job of kind of rolling it out to us, but we weren't willing to just take it and look at it and say, this is what the treating physician has to do. That would be too easy, and that would, to me, be failure. You wouldn't succeed. You wouldn't be able to talk about success in the return to work space if you left certain stakeholders out. And to me, the employer is the biggest stakeholder for obvious reasons. The injured worker is clearly a stakeholder, but the injured worker wants to kind of stay out of it because they want to, they don't want to go back to work. A lot of them. I think those that want to do it, they don't need to listen to our presentation. They find a way, you know. But when you look at this presentation, think about it as multidiscipline involving every player on the field. So now we get, this is what Gary wants to talk about, actually. So it's kind of interesting that we can get to 9:55 when we're at Gary's topic. Hey Gary, how you doing? Last time I'll be speaking here, but what do the treating physicians need to do? And I have to say treating, we can also assume second medical opinions and independent physicians. We have no control over state-appointed IVs. Everybody knows that. I can't tell them what to do. We just wait for their report, they break the tie. But when you look at the whole space of the treating physician, or any physician, what do they need to do?
So I guess I have to put two different hats on. As a treating physician, which is what I am most commonly, when you take care of injured workers, I think trying to forecast to them the next step with respect to treatment and return to work is helpful. That way it's not a surprise when you say at 6 weeks after their rotator cuff repair, you're going to start bleeding out of your sling, and I would suggest at that point maybe you can go back to light duty. I might still have you wear the sling at work, but we should be able to advance your status. You're going to be able to do more. So I think forecasting is important. I also think negotiation is important. I think if you're too hard and everything is just black and white, that doesn't work. It backfires. I lose a patient. They're gone. They get an attorney. And the case is over. They are lost. So I think trying to negotiate with them, maybe we could try to light duty next visit, or if they say no, I can't do anything. Well, what can you do? Can you brush your teeth? Can you hold a clipboard? Could you do clerical work if that were available? I know you may not be able to, weld overhead because you had a shoulder injury, but trying to forecast and negotiate, I think, is really important. I also think trying to break down the return to work into 3 different categories. Number 1, if I return them to work, do they have any unnecessary risk associated with that? Number 2, capacity. What can they actually do? Can they raise their arm overhead after their rotator cuff repair, or are they limited because their recovery has not progressed to that level? And then 3, tolerance, which is how much discomfort are they willing to accept in exchange for the benefits of return to work. And that is a personal decision which I can't make for them. So I have to break it down in those 3 categories, which is how it's suggested by the AMA guides to return to work.
I've got one curious question, because wants to make money off of you, your PCP, if that's the truth. Do you ever have a conversation with them where you somehow let them understand that they are taking their life and basically not just hit the pause button, probably hit the stop button?
Well, you know, that's an excellent point, and I think as physicians, we often think, well, if I talk to the patient, they don't really understand, okay? And so you don't really have to do it. But to be honest with you, in my own practice, I literally talk to the patient, give them the statistic from the medical literature, and I even pull the literature from my patient, and I give them the article. And you'd be surprised how many of them like it, and they read it, and some of them even come back and ask for another copy. Dr. Nguyen, you have something else? You know? And I would pull it and let them read it, but you'd be surprised how many patients like that.
So you take.
I take actual statistics from studies, and I explain it to them.
You're giving it something that's independent. It doesn't look like you're judging them.
Right.
It's information.
It's very important that they know the consequences of being unemployed.
What else do you think the treating physician, or you for that matter, what do you feel you have to do as you look at the situation to enhance the injured worker's ability to return?
Well, you know, as a physician, you have an obligation, and whether or not it's a workers' comp patient or group health patient, your job is to do the very best for that patient, okay? So if you know he or she has a condition, your job is to get that. First of all, here's another thing that's very important in workers' comp. Get the diagnosis correct. Okay, we have reviewed many or examined patient many times, and these diagnoses are wrong. Okay, well it's not wrong. Okay, so say the patient failed, they passed out, and let's say they broke a leg. Okay, so the leg, yes, it does need to be treated, but you need to know why did the patient pass out to prevent another incident. Okay, so a lot of the time there's things behind the scene with the patient that needs to be addressed. The patient is a total patient. The patient is not a body part. The problem with medicine in this country is we are specialist oriented. Okay, so you go to ortho looks at musculoskeletal, you go to cardiology, they look at the heart, but nobody's looking at the patient as a whole. And very often when I see patients and you look at the list of medications, it's this long, okay? And some of the medication are duplicate, you get into polypharmacy, all kind of stuff, and then the patient is taken or not taken, who knows? They don't know what to do with all these meds. Or worse yet, if they take them, they get into all these drug-drug interaction. But as a treating doctor, you have an obligation, whether or not that's an injured body part or not, you have the obligation to look at the patient as a whole and see what's wrong with them.
So when I look at this topic, the one thing that comes to mind is how, not always the case, but when you all think about construction jobs, when you think about major renovation jobs, they always have phases, kind of how they get paid, but they have phases, and they show you what they're going to do. Phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and that final phase 4 completion. I don't think in the medical community, and I understand that a lot of it is because you don't know how the patient's going to respond, but we talk about time frames for recovery, we talk about expected duration of pain, we talk about the protocols that are going to be used. And for the nurse case managers out there, when you talk about conferences, it is, in my mind, critical that the doctor be held to some kind of a plan that has some recognition of duration.
I guess the rebuttal to that is, as a doctor, we want our patients to like us, right? A part of the patient-doctor relationship is we want to have a good rapport with our patients. So we can be easily manipulated.
Why don't you call us back?
That's a good point. But we can be easily manipulated by patients, particularly people that don't do a lot of work injuries. They don't want to engage in the process because it's time consuming. It can result in confrontation between you and your patient. It can make a patient do bad Google review of you, which is very important to your ability to market yourself for future patient care. So I think that it comes down to, for the non-litigated patient, that a lot of doctors don't want the confrontation of having to discuss work status, and we also we may not want to do anything to sabotage the rapport that we're trying to develop with the patient-doctor relationship. I think as someone like Trang and I who take care of work injuries, we understand that it's actually beneficial and therapeutic for someone to return to work. But someone who doesn't do that frequently probably doesn't know that. It's not something you get in your residency that return to work is important.
Are you all taught anything about treatment plans and references to time, or is that not really considered something that is a best practice?
It is not. It's definitely anecdotal and experience-based for most doctors, as opposed to most doctors don't look up ODG to see how long their ACL tear should be out of work. There may be some exceptions to that, like for example, with an ACL tear, we're told that they should not return to sports for 9 months because the risk of re-rupture is much higher early on. But as far as return to work, it's anecdotal and experience-based for most doctors, not evidence-based.
Do you agree with that as far as what, if anything, can we all do to create greater accountability on the part of the treating physicians to have some kind of a time frame? We're on the clock right now. It's 10:05. We've got 10 more minutes. That's, time frame. So what do y'all have to do? Or what can you do?
I think if the employer, number one, provide that job description to the treating doctor, okay? Number two, I know you guys don't have ODG, but there's evidence-based guidelines. Even the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons have it. Every single specialty have it for every diagnosis, okay? You might want to print those out and give it to the doctor. Some of these resistant ones that we run into, I would print out the treatment guidelines for that condition. And I would say, doctor, here's the treatment guidelines from your academy, okay? And, help me out here, okay?
That's a really good point. We could talk about pitfalls, not being trained, clear understanding of the injured workers, job description. I think everybody agrees on that. And so if we talk about the treating physician, and the two physicians we have up here are very nice and not rude, but I think if they wanted to be rude, they'd say, nobody ever gives us a description of what they do, and how can I treat this person and decide when I can release them if I don't know what I'm releasing them to?
I think that's very important. I also think when there are work status forms from employers, you shouldn't need a microscope to read the form. If it is so detailed, it is probably going to be rejected by the treating doctor and filed into the trash, unfortunately. It needs to be practical, something that's easy to read. And again, I go back to the flexibility with respect to accepting light-duty work restrictions as being so important.
So our final aspect of this presentation, and we'll try to open up quickly to questions. I don't want Gary to let us know. I think you were like a principal at an elementary or high school in another life, but that's another story. What are the risks of not having, and I'm going to use the word, a successful return to work program? Because you can have it, but if it isn't successful, you might as well say you don't have it. So what do you see, Dr. Nguyen, as some of the risks? We've kind of already talked about it.
Well, you're going to pay indemnity and pay indemnity and pay it and pay it and pay it, okay? Then in Louisiana, you have your Medicare set aside. Then you have a person out there that's unemployed to society, period. And so it just doesn't benefit anyone.
Thoughts?
I think the statistics basically say when someone's been out of work for 6 months, their probability of ever returning to work is very rare. If you don't have a return to work program for many injuries, particularly those that are surgical, they won't be able to return to work by 6 months. So I think trying to get someone back early and keep them at work in some capacity is very important.
We talked about the psychological effects of not having a successful return to work program. And I think we all know, we've seen it kind of cut back a little bit with the use of narcotics, pain management, to just prolong a disability in la-la land with addiction and everything else. It almost goes without saying. We're almost at the point where we can just open it up for some final questions, if that's what you would like us to do, sir. Okay, Gary's gave me a thumbs up or something. Yeah, one of his fingers up. I'm not sure which one. So let's go ahead and I'm kind of capable of directing the questions to one of the two, because I know you don't have any questions of me. Does anyone have any questions? Is anybody willing to kind of make us feel good? Oh, I don't even have to try to get somebody to ask a question. You got a question?
Hi, I'm on the copy. I am a vocational case manager.
Can you speak in that mic a little better?
I am. Hey, I'm a vocational case manager, and along the lines of all of the return to work information for physicians. My specific question, and probably more so a statement, is I believe they need to be more understanding of the process of return to work. What we do is provide a job description, but you won't review it until a week or two later. That job is no longer viable for us. So I think from a physician standpoint, you guys need to understand how time is of the essence when a physician is identified for someone. Once you guys have even released them in a light sedentary whatever duty capacity, just help us out to get them back as soon as possible.
So you're not really asking the question, but you're making a good point. Your point is that the timely issuance of a job description to the treating physician.
Correct. If you have released them, great, thank you. But once we see through that job description, to say, hey, is this something within their capacity that you released?
Right.
And sign off on it, please, or whatever.
And you're speaking from what vantage point? Are you working for the employer, or are you in the field of being a nurse case management?
I'm in the field of being a vocational case manager.
Okay, gotcha. I don't disagree with you. I think that sometimes what we find is that it's believed that they're jumping the gun to start doing that, and you don't know. And so many of these cases, it starts off with it was going to be surgical intervention or non-surgical. Meaning is they're going to require treatment that is far more invasive, and then there's all this foolishness about, what you say, about specialties. Oh, well, orthopedic surgeon, we really need to have a neurosurgeon, and then we need to have a pain management. So the thing that I don't like about the challenge is that they have a, as you all know, a right to a choice in every subspecialty, every specialty, and they take full advantage of it.
I understand from that standpoint, though, but my point of view is once you've done your treatment and you got to the point of where they've been released from your point of view in some capacity, and we as vocational case managers start researching alternative job options for them within the capacity you release them within, and we locate positions that we think are going to be sufficient for it, and we submit them to you, instead of just replying to it at that time because the position is currently open. You say, schedule a conference, pay my $500, not you per se, I'm sorry. Not that I'm angry.
The thought there is every one of those I sign off on, I'm going to get a tax on. So we usually require prepayment for that. I know that the deposition with the opposite side of someone like Alan, they're going to attack me for every one of those job descriptions. So every one of those exposes me to an attack. So that's kind of how we've always required prepayment for them in my office, because we know what's coming when we get that. It's going to be a deposition where someone's basically trying to attack our credibility.
Okay, Dr. Lurie, I don't mean to interject, but I will.
Okay. Well, let's do this. We're only going to have a couple more minutes.
I just want to make a point in what he just said, is that I understand that you feel that you will be attacked if you reply to us, but if I'm of the right understanding, when you release someone within a sedentary-like duty position, the jobs that are being submitted to you are or should be within that sedentary-like duty capacity, where would the attack come from? Because if we're working within what you gave us and the provisions you provided, why are we therefore putting you under attack if we're just asking you to agree with what you needed us?
That's a fair point. I think what we ultimately see is that first, the treating physician indicates that they've reached MMI. You got to have that. Can't do anything without MMI, maximum medical improvement. And then they determine what restrictions, if any, exist. Then that goes to the employer, and the employer looks at whether or not they have some position available that fits within those restrictions. And that's kind of the way I see the process. Sir?
Yes, just to point something out here as a comment, back up what the experts have been talking about. The issue of return to work is not just a matter of opinion. There is a published study came out from the Journal of Health Economics in May of 2003, where they studied approximately 30,000 people and found that the simple fact of taking someone off of work raised their risk of death by 46%. And death was caused by all causes, including death from cancer, heart disease, motor vehicle accidents, suicide, homicide, and name. The risk of death increased by 46% just because they were taken off work. So this is not something that's a matter of opinion. This is fact.